we go. So after today, if you want to come back and read through the notes on your own, you can find them right here under the Respiratory System Thursday Notes section of week 3. And then I'm also recording as of right now. And so I'll be posting the recording of this Zoom meeting under our Zoom meeting recording section. I'll make a new tab for the respiratory system notes on 9/17. So with that, let's talk about how we get that oxygen from the air around us actually into our body. Let's talk about the respiratory system. Alrighty, there we go. That looks good right there. So, respiratory system. We got our mouth, our throat, and our lungs, and a little guy down here called the diaphragm that we'll get to later, all working together to suck in and push out air. So the reason that I like to talk about the circulatory and the respiratory system together in the same week is because they are like this. The respiratory and circulatory system work extremely closely together. And so the whole purpose of that close connection of the respiratory and circulatory system is to exchange gas between the air and our blood, right? So with oxygen, the oxygen is in the air, but we want it to be in our bloodstream so that it can go and give oxygen to the cells of our body. For carbon dioxide, which is a waste product that our body produces, we want to get that out of our cells and into the air. And so the link between the respiratory system and the circulatory system is where this exchange happens. Oxygen going in and carbon dioxide coming out. So the respiratory system also helps to regulate how much oxygen and carbon dioxide is in our bloodstream. If you get too much or too little of either one of these in your blood, you could be in bad shape and possibly even die. Yes, you can get too much oxygen in your blood. And so the respiratory system has a series of kind of balances that help to make sure that the oxygen and carbon dioxide saturation in our blood levels is at the right amount. So circulatory system drops off the oxygen to our cells and picks up the carbon dioxide. The respiratory system brings the oxygen in, gives it to the blood in our circulatory system, and takes the carbon dioxide, the CO2, away so that we can get rid of it every time we breathe out. All right, so the respiratory system is entirely located in the upper half of your body, your head, your neck, and your chest. And so today we're going to kind of trace the path of oxygen as it goes down in through your nose and mouth and your trachea, splits into your lungs, drops off the oxygen, and then comes back up out through your lungs, your trachea, and your mouth. So we're going to go kind of through each one of these systems one by one and talk about what they do and how they help us with breathing. So speaking of breathing, and speaking of the diaphragm, like Brenda was asking about a second ago. So the diaphragm is a large flat muscle that sits basically right below your rib cage. So if you can kind of feel where your ribs are in your chest, and a tight band running right underneath those ribs is this large flat diaphragm muscle. And your diaphragm is actually what is responsible for you breathing in and out. So whenever you do a deep breath in and out, you're actually not consciously having an effect on your, like the lungs and your bones around here don't have any muscle in them, right? You can't move those on your own, on their own. You have to use the diaphragm down here, right underneath it. That does all the moving and the pushing and pulling of the air for you. And so the way that it works is actually really cool, and to me, really interesting, and one of the coolest things about the respiratory system. So when you inhale, right, when you take a deep breath in, the diaphragm contracts, so it squeezes essentially. And when it does, it essentially kind of flattens out, right? So your diaphragm was sitting sort of like this up here, and then it contracts and flattens out. So when this flattening happens, it creates extra space in your chest cavity, right? Because the diaphragm used to be way up here. Actually, hold on, I can draw little pictures for us. So the diaphragm used to be like way up here earlier, right? But when we breathe in, that diaphragm goes down and flattens out. This makes there be more space in our chest cavity. And so when that more space is there, air is going to be pulled in order to fill up that space. So your diaphragm is essentially creating a space in your chest that then gets filled up by putting air into your lungs. Your lungs are sort of like little balloons. And so when there's this extra space created by the diaphragm, the air rushes in and fills it up, right? So when you're breathing in, when you're inhaling, you are not actually physically like moving the air into your lungs. Instead, what's happening is the diaphragm contracting is forcing air to be pulled into your lungs. It's creating like this little vacuum inside your chest cavity that air rushes into in order to fill up. And this is what lets you go. Take in the air by contracting and flattening the diaphragm. So the air rushes into your lungs to fill in that extra space. So that's when the diaphragm is contracted, you're pulling air in. Then what about the other way? What about when we push out the air? Basically, it is the opposite process. There we go. So when you're exhaling, you're relaxing your diaphragm. So you had it all tense and contracted when you're inhaling, but then when you relax it, you exhale. And the air kind of gets passively pushed out of your lungs. So the diaphragm relaxes, it puts pressure on your lungs underneath here, and that pressure causes air to be pushed out of the lungs. Right? Excuse me. So you pulled all this air in by tensing up your diaphragm, and then when you relax the diaphragm, it goes in to this wider shape, and it pushes up on the lungs, which pushes the air out, and you exhale. Right? So inhale, tight contracted diaphragm pulls the air in, and then exhale, diaphragm relaxes, it releases, and it pushes that air up and out. So here's a little bit kind of better picture of what's going on. When you inhale and the air moves in, that's when your diaphragm is contracting downward. It's really pushing down hard. This allows for your ribs and your lungs to expand and the air gets sucked in. Then, when you exhale, you essentially just relax the diaphragm, right? It naturally wants to be up in this curved position like this. So when you relax, the diaphragm goes back up, it pushes on your lungs, and this pushes the air out of your respiratory system. So contraction sucks the air in, and then relax, push the air back out. So that is the role of the diaphragm. It actually is what is in control of your breathing, right? So while the air comes in through your mouth and your nose, though you don't control how much or how quickly the air goes in and out by muscles in your mouth or muscles up here in your upper chest, it's only this one muscle down here, the diaphragm. That is what controls the airflow going in and out of your lungs. So it's all depending on whether the diaphragm is creating space and creating that vacuum for air to rush in, or whether the diaphragm is pushing up, taking up space and pushing that air up and out. All right. Any questions so far on the diagram or kind of the mechanical aspect of respiration, of breathing?
No, you answered my question just now.
Awesome. Perfect. Good to know. Looks like nobody has a question in the chat either. So that is the diaphragm. That is what's actually getting the air into and out of your system. But as the air comes in, there's a specific pathway, a specific set of structures that it goes through in order to go from the air right outside your face to down inside of your lungs. So we can kind of split our respiratory tract into two sections. The upper respiratory tract, which would be like your head and your neck. And then the lower respiratory tract, which would be the bronchial tree, which is kind of like the tubes that expand out in your chest, and then your lungs themselves, the actual larger kind of balloon structures that contain the air that you're taking in. And so we're going to go through each one of these structures kind of one by one and talk about what they're doing and what the air is doing as it goes through. So up first you have your nose and also your mouth to some extent. We're mostly going to focus on the nose here. So inside of your nose is a fairly large cavity known as the nasal cavity. And your nose has a whole bunch of different structures in it. None of these are super important to keep track of right now. But for a lot of the cases, this is your first contact of the air with the inside of your body. The little hairs that are inside your nose are called cilia. Sometimes, if you're like me, you have a problem where your cilia want to stick outside of your nose and you have to get a special little shaver in order to get them back inside. But these guys are really important along with the mucus in your nose. So it's not just there to be annoying and to get all stuffy during allergy season. The mucus and the cilia, the hairs together, are actually what help stop dust and particles and bacteria from getting down into your digestive system. They're sort of like your first line of defense against the particles that are in the air that maybe we don't want going all the way down into our lungs. So just past the nose is kind of a set of two structures that one of which we've talked about a little bit before in the digestive system. So the pharynx is kind of just past the nose, around the area where the nose and the mouth meet. So like kind of right here-ish. And so the pharynx is sort of where air and food can both get to, right? So right at the back of your mouth is a little gap where it meets up with your nasal cavity. And so that's a common passageway for air and food as well. But as we start to travel down the throat, we do not want air and food going to the same place, right? We talked about earlier that we really do not want food or water going into our lungs. So instead, we have our little epiglottis right here that while we are just breathing and living normally, it stays open. But when you go through and swallow, that epiglottis flaps down, it covers up your airway, the larynx and the trachea, which we'll talk about in just a slide or two, so that food does not end up going down and getting into your lungs, because food or water in your lungs could do a lot of damage. So our epiglottis is here in order to let the air go through when we're breathing, but block it off and stop food and water from going through. So right underneath the epiglottis is the larynx, which is most famous for having your vocal cords in there. So your larynx is right underneath your epiglottis, and when you're talking, like I'm doing right now, you can feel your throat vibrating. And so the reason that you're able to talk and produce sounds with your mouth is because when you're talking, you're slowly exhaling air over the larynx, and the larynx is vibrating in a very particular fashion. In our case, it vibrates in order to produce vowel and consonant sounds when we talk, when we put words together. And so that's kind of the first area of our throat after we split off between the throat section, or excuse me, the air section and the food section. The larynx is kind of the first part that we pass by. And again, when we're talking, air is going up and out through the larynx, so up and out this way. And those vocal cords are vibrating and allowing us to create sound in the air. Right underneath the larynx is the trachea, and this guy is the major windpipe or airway in the upper part of your respiratory system. So similar to your nose, it's got some mucus and some cilia in there to try and help prevent any little particles that got by your nose from going down into your lungs. And the trachea is so important. It has these extra little bands of cartilage kind of surrounding it. So whenever you see like a picture or a drawing of a trachea, we'll usually include these kind of little striations here. And those cartilage rings help to hold the trachea open, prevent the airway from accidentally closing down, right? Because this is just muscle making up the airway. So there's not a whole lot of structure naturally in there. So these cartilage rings help to make sure it stays open and that the muscle of the airway doesn't actually end up getting in the way of us breathing. Because as you all are probably aware, breathing is very important if you want to stay alive for much longer than a couple minutes. So this cartilage in the trachea helps to prevent it from collapsing. So the trachea is sort of the largest section of our upper respiratory tract, right? This is what connects our mouth and our larynx and pharynx up here at the top with our lungs and the lower respiratory tract here down in our chest. So this is the tube that carries the air from our head to our chest, essentially. Once it gets down into your chest, into kind of the middle section or the upper middle section of your chest, it it splits into two branches. And these guys are known as the bronchi. So one bronchi is, well, I shouldn't say that. One is called a bronchus, but the two together are the bronchi. And so we have the right bronchi and the left bronchi. These are what go into your lungs. So we don't have just one lung right in the middle of our body, right? We have two on either side. And so as the trachea comes down into our chest, it has to split so that the air can get to our lungs. And how does the air get to our lungs from our trachea? It goes through the bronchi. So these little guys right down here, set up similarly to the trachea, where it's this muscle with these little cartilage striations on it. And so as the bronchi split and go into the lungs, once they are inside the lungs, they'll split into smaller and smaller and smaller tubes. And these tiny little tubes are called bronchioles. So they get their own fancy name since they're so small and inside the lungs. So we have these these primary bronchi that split off from the trachea and go one to each lung. And then once they're in the lungs, they'll split and branch more and more, kind of like a tree in your yard. Only this time, instead of it being sticks, it's tiny little tubes carrying air. So as these bronchioles get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually at the tiniest, farthest away section of them, they'll terminate in tiny, tiny little air sacs called alveoli. So Matt actually brought these up a couple weeks ago when we were in the digestive system. So these are different than the villi. So if you remember, the villi are those weird little finger things that stick up out of your intestine to absorb the nutrients. The alveoli are these tiny little balloon-like sacs that occur at the very tips of the very, very small bronchioles in our lungs. All right, so before we get into the alveoli, are there any questions about the different structures that we've talked about so far and how we get from our mouth down into our chest and our lungs? All righty, if not, and it doesn't look like we've got any coming up in the chat either. So the reason why I wanted to stop right there is because the alveoli have a lot going on, and so we're going to be talking a lot about them. Brenda just asked, yes, so bronchi are the passageway from the trachea to the lungs. That is a good way to describe them. So each bronchi carries air from our central trachea into either the right lung or the left lung. All right, so moving on from there to the alveoli. The alveoli are extremely, extremely important for respiration because this is where we actually have the meeting of the respiratory system in the air and the circulatory system with the blood. So alveoli look really funky. We're going to be looking at a lot of pictures of them over the next couple of slides. There are these weird little bubbly balloon structures. So they almost kind of look like broccoli, sort of. If you imagine that instead of the tips of broccoli being little green nubs, they were tiny little balloons. And so this is the final place that air will go into during respiration. So as we breathe in, we're taking air all the way from our mouth down into the alveoli in our lungs. And then when we exhale, we're pushing air out of the alveoli up back through all the structures we just came through and up out through the mouth and nose. So there are these super, super thin little pockets, little bubbles of air where the gas is going to be exchanged between the blood and the air. So the oxygen is going to come out of the air and go into the blood, and the carbon dioxide is going to come out of the blood and go into the air. They have a special protection over them that helps them to stop, like not stick to each other, and allows them to completely inflate and deflate properly as we breathe. So in order to understand how exactly the oxygen and carbon dioxide are getting passed off from these alveoli to the blood, we have to talk about an extremely important yet basic scientific concept known as diffusion. So diffusion is the concept in chemistry and physics, how whenever you have particles of one type, they tend to move from area of higher concentration, so where they're really, really concentrated, to areas of lower concentration. So particles tend to spread out from one another as they enter an area. So diffusion is why if I went to the corner of, like if we were still back in a classroom, if I went over into the corner of a class and sprayed some like fabric softener or some like Febreze or something up into the air, and let's say Katie was sitting in the far corner of the classroom, after a couple minutes, Katie would be able to smell the air freshener because all the little air freshener particles that were sprayed out of the Febreze bottle slowly diffused throughout the room until they kind of equally got spread out. So they were super, super concentrated when immediately after they came out of the bottle. And so they wanted to travel further across the room so that they could become less concentrated. So the same thing is happening with the dye in this picture. This person dropped some food coloring or some type of dye into this water. Initially, the drops were all super close and sticking together, but over time, the drops spread out, right? They moved into areas where there was less dye until eventually there was kind of an even coating of dye throughout the entire liquid. That's what's being shown in this little picture down here as well. We have all of these little red particles that are in this corner of the room, and due to diffusion, these particles will move from this corner into being more evenly spread out throughout the room. So, why is this important for respiration in our lungs? Well, in the air, there is a relatively high concentration of oxygen compared to our blood, which has a very low concentration of oxygen. So remember, our blood going to the lungs is very low oxygen blood. It's used up most of its oxygen, giving it away to the cells that need it, and now it's coming back to the lungs for more. So the air oxygen level is like way up here, and the blood oxygen level is way down here. So when the alveoli and the capillaries of the blood vessels come into contact, the air will naturally move, the oxygen, excuse me, will naturally move from the air where it's high down into the blood where it's low. So this process happens naturally in the alveoli, and that's how we get the oxygen from the air into the blood. We bring the air as close to the blood as we can get it without actually like injecting air straight into the bloodstream. And then the oxygen will naturally diffuse from the air into the red blood cells of our bloodstream. So again, here are some alveoli. They have that weird kind of bubbly, balloony look. And each alveoli is covered in these capillaries, in these very, very small blood vessels. Because again, as the blood flows across it, so we have our pulmonary artery right here. And if you remember, the pulmonary artery is taking blood away from the heart to the lungs. So the pulmonary artery will take all of this low oxygen blood across an alveoli. This blood is high in carbon dioxide, which the air is relatively low in carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide in the blood naturally goes into the alveoli, and then when we breathe out, we get rid of that carbon dioxide. When we breathe in, the air coming into the alveoli has the high oxygen content, so the oxygen will diffuse from the air in the alveoli into the bloodstream, making it nice and high in oxygen, and it'll travel back through that pulmonary vein back to the heart so that it can go out to the body and give away all its oxygen until it comes back and picks up some more. So as the blood is going across the alveoli, the CO2 is being dropped into the alveoli because the air CO2 is low and the blood CO2 is high. So the blood gives the CO2 to the air, that gets exhaled, and then we inhale. The oxygen in the alveoli is high, and so it gives the oxygen to the bloodstream, which is low. And then the blood carries that out to our heart and the rest of our body. So again, another picture of our weird bubble alveoli here. And again, each one is covered in these veins and arteries and capillaries so that we can get maximum oxygen absorption through these alveoli. Because we need lots and lots of oxygen for our body to survive. So we want to make sure we can pull as much oxygen out of the air as possible each time we breathe in and breathe out. So again, if here is our little capillary bloodstream right here with some blood cells in it. And then here is our little alveoli. So these are tiny thin walls that separate them, right? Like microscopically thin. So the air comes in, the oxygen diffuses into our bloodstream, into the red blood cells. And then the CO2 that's in our blood cells diffuses out of the blood and into the alveoli over here. So gas exchange is really the most important part of respiration. It is why we're able to continuously bring oxygen into our body from the air around us. It's all due to this diffusion between the alveoli and the bloodstream. All right, so this video may or may not work exactly with, you guys may or may not be able to hear the audio as we go through, but I'm probably going to be mostly talking over it anyways. So here we have our heart, we have an alveoli up here, and we have some body cells down here. Don't worry about PO2, it's just talking about the amount of oxygen in the air. So essentially this is just saying that there's lots of oxygen in the fresh air. Blah, blah, blah. So remember, oxygen was like 100 something and CO2 is like 0.3. So lots of oxygen in the air coming in, not very much carbon dioxide. Again, don't worry about that. So we got high oxygen, low CO2 in the alveoli. The blood that's coming up has low oxygen and high CO2. So the oxygen in the alveoli diffuses into the blood. That's what the little red particles are doing. And then the CO2 in the blood diffuses into the alveoli. I'm just gonna go ahead and stop the talking. So we've got our oxygen molecules that are going into the blood and our carbon dioxide molecules that are leaving the blood and going into the alveoli. So oxygen going one way, carbon dioxide going another way. Eventually, as the blood goes across the alveoli and it's absorbed lots of oxygen and dropped off lots of CO2, it'll become a little bit more balanced with the alveoli. So kind of that prevents us from losing too much carbon dioxide or taking in too much oxygen into the blood. As we go across, we kind of pick up oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide until they're fairly balanced. Then again, we go back to the heart that pumps us out to the body cells. And the body cells always need oxygen because they are used the oxygen in order to keep themselves alive, essentially. And whenever they do use oxygen, they build up a bunch of carbon dioxide. So you'll see the little blue carbon dioxide bubbles are going to go from our body cells into the blood, and the blood is going to drop off more oxygen for our body cells. Again, you can ignore all the numbers that are up here. Just pay attention to what our little blue CO2s and red oxygens are doing. And then similarly to the alveoli from earlier, the more oxygen that we drop off and the more CO2 that we pick up, the less exchange there's going to be between the body cells and the blood, because they're going to be pretty close to having equal amounts of oxygen and CO2 towards the end. So once that happens, we carry all of that stuff back to the heart, and then that right ventricle pumps us back to the lungs, where we get that whole exchange happening over again. Oxygen coming into the blood and carbon dioxide going out. All right, so I know I just hit you with a lot of scientific terminology just there. Any questions about how or why the diffusion works to move oxygen and carbon dioxide around the way that it does? Anybody still have any questions on how the capillaries and blood and the alveoli kind of work with each other? Alrighty, not seeing any questions pop up from everybody, so everybody seems pretty okay with that. So the final section is just going to be a little bit more detail on kind of this gas exchange stuff going on, specifically about what's happening in the red blood cells. So red blood cells have a special protein in them called hemoglobin. And this is where they actually bind to the oxygen. So when the oxygen goes into the bloodstream, it doesn't just diffuse into like the plasma of the blood and then get kind of carried along willy-nilly. Instead, as soon as it enters the bloodstream, it gets bound up by the hemoglobin inside our red blood cells. And then, as the red blood cells pass by tissue in the body, the hemoglobin will release the oxygen and it'll pass through the body cell and go and be put to work inside of the body cell. So we have the oxygen that diffuses into the blood from the lungs over here. So this is like our alveoli over here, and these little orangey bubbles are oxygen. So they diffuse into the blood where they're bound up by the hemoglobin of the red blood cell. Each red blood cell can carry 4 oxygen molecules. So that's why you see 4 little dots on this hemoglobin right here, because it has 4 places to bind to the oxygen that comes into the blood. Then, as the red blood cell passes through a capillary by a body tissue cell, like a bone cell or a muscle cell, the hemoglobin will release the oxygen and it'll diffuse over into that body cell. Then the reverse happens with carbon dioxide. So just like before, only in reverse, we have lots of carbon dioxide in our body cell that will diffuse over into our blood. Unlike oxygen, carbon dioxide can travel just through the bloodstream and the plasma. Sometimes it'll bind to other stuff as well. But you can bind a couple carbon dioxides to hemoglobin. It's not quite as well as oxygen, but you can still do it. And then finally, once this red blood cell and once the CO2 in the blood passes by the alveoli, that CO2 will diffuse and go into the alveoli and be breathed out of our body. And while it's doing that, the oxygen will be moving in. So here's kind of a big and slightly blurry and messy overview of basically everything that we just talked about. So we've got our nose and our mouth, our nasal cavity up here. That passes through the pharynx, so that little common area. And then the epiglottis cuts off our airways if we're swallowing, but if we're not, then we can pass down past the larynx and the voice box into the trachea. The trachea will then sprint into the left and right bronchi over here, which go inside the lungs. Then those bronchi will divide and divide into the little tiny bronchioles. Once they do that, the bronchioles all end in these alveoli, these weird broccoli-looking air bubbly things, which are covered in capillaries. And so once the air is inside of the alveoli, the blood that's traveling through the capillaries will drop off the CO2 that's in it. Oxygen will diffuse into the blood. It'll then go back around to the heart and be pumped out to the body. And as it goes by the body cells, the oxygen will be dropped off to the body and the CO2 will be picked up. And that is pretty much everything that you guys have to know about the respiratory system in a nutshell. So any questions about any different parts of the respiratory system? The diaphragm and how it's used for breathing, all the different air passageway and tubes, or how the alveoli and capillaries work together to diffuse oxygen and carbon dioxide. Right. So the worksheet for this set of notes is a little bit similar to the one that you did for the different parts of the heart. So let's go ahead and take a look at it really quick. Again, remember that since you guys are awesome and came to the Zoom meeting tonight, you've already got your attendance credit for today. So it's totally fine if you wait until tomorrow or later on this weekend to do this assignment. So we have a kind of diagram of the respiratory system right here. And then for each one of these structures that's labeled corresponds with a different named structure down here in the questions. So we've got the nose and nasal cavity, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, the alveoli, the diaphragm, and the lung. And so for each one of these questions, I want you to tell me two things. Which letter up here represents that structure that's named in the question? And what is the role of that structure in the respiratory system? What does that structure do in order to help get air from the outside down into the alveoli? And what does it do once it's inside the alveoli? So if you do the Google Forms version, it'll look like this with the questions all down here below. If you do the Google Docs version, it's the exact same material, just set up a little bit differently. So in this one, we have the picture down below, and we have the table up here. And so for each one of the listed structures, just like the previous type of form, the Google form, you can fill in the letter that you think it goes in, and then fill out the role of that particular structure, what it does for the respiratory system. So that's what the assignment that goes with these notes looks like for today. Again, since you guys are here today, you don't have to worry about finishing that up tonight. If you don't want to, you can get back to work on it on Friday or over the weekend. So before we wrap up here today, any final questions about the respiratory system or the labeling worksheet? Alrighty. Well, if you guys are all good, let me